Sarah Martinez had always believed that appearances could be deceiving, but she never imagined how dramatically that truth would play out on a cold Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago. Walking briskly down Michigan Avenue with her worn leather messenger bag slung across her shoulder, she looked like any other young professional heading to work. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a plain black sweater over dark jeans. Nothing about her appearance suggested she held one of the most classified positions in federal law enforcement. The morning had started like any other. Sarah had grabbed her usual coffee from the corner cafe, checked her secure phone for any overnight developments, and began her walk to the regional field office. She preferred walking when possible, finding that the fresh air helped her think through complex cases. Today, her mind was occupied with Operation Nightfall, a multi-agency investigation she had been leading for the past 8 months. The case involved a sophisticated network of international arms dealers, and they were finally closing in on the key players. As she turned onto State Street, Sarah noticed increased police activity around the federal building. Squad cars were positioned at strategic points, and officers were conducting what appeared to be routine security checks. She assumed it was part of the heightened security measures that had been implemented following recent intelligence reports about potential threats to federal facilities. What she didn't realize was that she was about to become the center of a very public misunderstanding. Officer Jake Rodriguez had been on the force for 3 years, and today was shaping up to be particularly stressful. His sergeant had briefed the morning shift about reports of suspicious individuals potentially surveilling federal buildings. The description was vague: young adults, possibly carrying bags or packages, appearing to loiter or take unusual interest in security measures. Rodriguez was positioned near the federal building entrance, scanning the crowd for anyone matching the broad description. When Sarah approached the building, Rodriguez noticed her immediately. She was young, carried a bag, and seemed to be observing the increased police presence with what he interpreted as unusual interest. To Rodriguez, who was still learning to distinguish between legitimate concern and suspicious behavior, Sarah's careful attention to the security setup raised red flags. He didn't know that her trained eye was automatically cataloging security measures as part of her professional habits, a skill developed through years of federal law enforcement training. Sarah was about 50 feet from the building entrance when Rodriguez decided to approach her. She was focused on her phone, reviewing an encrypted message from her team about new developments in Operation Nightfall, when she heard someone calling out behind her. "Hey, you there with the black bag," Rodriguez called out, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he had been taught to use when addressing potential suspects. "I need to speak with you." Sarah looked up from her phone, initially confused. She glanced around to see if the officer was addressing someone else, but his eyes were fixed directly on her. Years of training kicked in, and she remained calm despite the unexpected attention. She had been in enough high-stakes situations to know that cooperation and de-escalation were usually the best initial approaches, even when you were in the right. "Is there a problem, officer?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice steady and professional. She took a few steps toward Rodriguez, her hands visible and her posture non-threatening. Rodriguez's partner, Officer Maria Santos, was watching from across the street. She had been on the force for 7 years and had developed better instincts for reading people and situations. As she observed the interaction beginning to unfold, something about the young woman's demeanor struck her as unusual. The woman didn't display the typical nervousness or defensiveness that most people showed when approached by police. Instead, she exhibited a calm professionalism that Santos had only seen in fellow law enforcement officers or military personnel. "We're conducting security checks in this area," Rodriguez explained, his hand resting on his radio. "I need to see some identification and ask you a few questions about what you're doing here." Sarah nodded and reached slowly into her back pocket for her wallet. As she did so, she made a mental note of the officer's badge number and began considering whether she should immediately identify herself as a federal agent. Her cover identity for Operation Nightfall required her to maintain a low profile, and revealing her true position could potentially compromise months of careful work. She decided to see how the situation developed before making that call. "Here's my driver's license," Sarah said, handing over her identification. The license showed her real name but listed her address as a safe house apartment that served as her official residence for the operation. Rodriguez examined the license carefully, noting the address and comparing the photo to the woman standing before him. Everything appeared to be in order, but his sergeant's briefing about potential surveillance had made him hypervigilant. He decided to probe further. "What brings you to this area today, Miss Martinez?" he asked, maintaining what he believed was appropriate professional distance. "I work nearby," Sarah replied truthfully. The federal field office was indeed nearby, though she couldn't be more specific without potentially blowing her cover. "I'm just heading to work like any other day." Rodriguez noticed that her answer was somewhat vague, which in his limited experience, he interpreted as potentially evasive. He had been trained to look for signs of deception, but he lacked the experience to distinguish between someone being deliberately evasive and someone being appropriately discreet about legitimate confidential work. "Where exactly do you work?" Rodriguez pressed, his tone becoming slightly more confrontational. Sarah felt the first flutter of concern. The officer was pushing into territory that could force her to either lie outright or compromise her operational security. She glanced toward the federal building, calculating her options. She could see other officers in the area, including what appeared to be a supervisor near the main entrance. "I work in the federal building," she said, gesturing toward the imposing structure. "I'm actually running a bit late for an important meeting." This response only heightened Rodriguez's suspicions. In his mind, someone who actually worked in the federal building would have proper identification readily available and wouldn't be approaching from the street like a visitor. Federal employees, he assumed, would use employee entrances or show credentials immediately when questioned by security personnel. "Do you have any work identification with you?" Rodriguez asked, his voice taking on a more demanding tone. Sarah hesitated. Her federal credentials were in her bag, but they identified her as a senior investigator with clearance levels that would raise questions about why she was walking alone on the street without security detail. Showing them would immediately blow her cover and could compromise Operation Nightfall at a critical juncture. "I prefer not to discuss the specifics of my work on a public street," Sarah said carefully. "If there's a security concern, perhaps we could handle this inside the building where appropriate personnel can verify my credentials." Rodriguez interpreted this response as defiance and possible obstruction. In his limited experience, legitimate federal employees were usually eager to prove their credentials when questioned by law enforcement. He made a decision that would soon escalate the situation beyond anyone's expectations. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me for additional questioning," Rodriguez said, reaching for his handcuffs. "Your responses have been evasive, and we need to determine your intentions regarding this federal facility." Sarah felt a surge of disbelief. She was a federal agent being treated as a potential security threat while trying to protect an ongoing investigation. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her, but she also understood that Rodriguez was following his training and doing what he believed was necessary to protect public safety. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Sarah said, maintaining her calm despite the rapidly escalating situation. "I'm happy to cooperate, but perhaps we should involve your supervisor before taking any formal action." Rodriguez was now convinced that Sarah was attempting to delay or avoid proper questioning. In his mind, an innocent person would comply immediately rather than trying to involve supervisors or create complications. He made the decision to detain her for further investigation. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Rodriguez ordered, moving toward Sarah with his handcuffs ready. Sarah found herself facing an impossible choice. She could submit to detention and hope that the situation would be resolved quickly without compromising her operation, or she could reveal her true identity and risk months of careful investigative work. She chose to comply with the officer's instructions while hoping that his supervisor would intervene before things went too far. As Rodriguez approached with the handcuffs, Sarah turned around and placed her hands behind her back as instructed. She could feel the weight of her service weapon concealed beneath her jacket and her federal credentials in her bag, both of which would soon create even more complications in an already complex situation. "This is a mistake, officer," Sarah said quietly as she felt the cold metal of the handcuffs being applied. "But I'm going to cooperate fully because I understand you're doing your job." Rodriguez secured the handcuffs and began to guide Sarah toward a nearby police vehicle. As they walked, several pedestrians stopped to watch the arrest, some taking photos and videos with their phones. Sarah kept her head up and her expression calm, drawing on her training to maintain composure under pressure. Officer Santos, who had been watching the interaction from across the street, began walking toward her partner and the detained woman. Her instincts told her that something about this arrest didn't feel right. The woman's calm compliance and professional demeanor continued to strike her as unusual for someone who was supposedly attempting to conduct surveillance on a federal building. As they reached the police vehicle, Rodriguez opened the back door and prepared to place Sarah inside. It was at this moment that Sarah made a decision that would change the trajectory of the entire situation. "Officer Rodriguez," she said, reading his name tag, "before you place me in that vehicle, I need you to look very carefully at the badge that's going to become visible when you move my jacket." Rodriguez paused, his hand on Sarah's elbow. He looked down and noticed for the first time that her black sweater had ridden up slightly during the detention process, revealing the edge of something metallic clipped to her belt beneath her jacket. Rodriguez hesitated, his training warring with curiosity. He had been taught to be thorough in his searches and investigations, but something in Sarah's tone gave him pause. There was no pleading or desperation in her voice, just a calm certainty that suggested she knew something he didn't. Against his better judgment, he decided to look. Carefully, Rodriguez lifted the edge of Sarah's jacket, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Clipped to her belt was a gold badge that he immediately recognized as federal law enforcement, but this wasn't just any federal badge. The design was unlike anything he had seen before, with security features and markings that indicated an extremely high level of classification. "Jesus," Rodriguez whispered under his breath, his hands beginning to shake slightly as the implications of what he was seeing began to sink in. Sarah could feel his grip on her elbow loosen and heard the sharp intake of breath. "Officer Rodriguez," she said quietly, "I'm going to need you to very carefully reach into my jacket pocket and retrieve my credentials. And I strongly suggest you do this away from the crowd that's gathering." Rodriguez looked around and realized that a significant crowd had indeed formed. People were holding up phones, recording what they believed was a routine arrest. Some were already posting to social media with captions speculating about what kind of criminal had been caught near the federal building. The situation was rapidly spiraling beyond his ability to control. Officer Santos had reached them by this point and immediately sensed her partner's distress. "Jake, what's going on?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "Maria, we have a problem," Rodriguez said, his voice tight with stress. "A big problem." Santos looked at Sarah, who remained calm despite being handcuffed and surrounded by gawking pedestrians. There was something in the woman's bearing that reminded Santos of her military service days, a particular kind of composure that came from extensive training and experience in high-pressure situations. "Officer Santos," Sarah said, somehow knowing her name despite never having met her before. "I'm going to suggest that you and your partner call for your watch commander immediately. And you might want to start dispersing this crowd before this situation becomes a much bigger problem for everyone involved." Santos exchanged a look with Rodriguez. The fact that this woman knew her name was concerning, but the calm authority in her voice was even more unsettling. This wasn't how criminals typically behaved when they were caught. Rodriguez, with trembling hands, reached into Sarah's jacket pocket and withdrew her credentials. When he opened the black leather case, his worst fears were confirmed. The identification showed that Sarah Martinez was not just a federal agent, but a senior special investigator with the Drug Enforcement Administration, holding security clearances that were far above his pay grade. "Oh God," Rodriguez muttered, immediately beginning to unlock the handcuffs. "Ma'am, I am so sorry. I had no idea." Sarah felt the handcuffs come off and flexed her wrists to restore circulation. "It's all right, Officer Rodriguez. You were doing your job. But we need to handle this situation very carefully now." Santos had moved to begin dispersing the crowd, using her experience and authority to convince people to move along. Several individuals were reluctant to leave, particularly those who had been recording, but her firm insistence eventually began to clear the immediate area. As the crowd thinned, Sarah turned to face Rodriguez, who looked like he was on the verge of panic. His face was pale, and sweat was beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The reality of what had just happened was hitting him hard. "Officer, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Sarah said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used when commanding operational situations. "What just happened here could potentially compromise an ongoing federal investigation that has taken months to develop. Do you understand what that means?" Rodriguez nodded miserably. He understood enough to know that his career was likely over and that he had potentially interfered with national security operations. The badge he had seen wasn't just any federal credentials, the security markings indicated involvement in classified operations at the highest levels. Sarah could see the panic in his eyes and realized she needed to de-escalate his emotional state before he did something that would make the situation worse. "Officer Rodriguez, look at me. This situation is not ideal, but it's not irreparable. We're going to handle this professionally, and I'm not looking to end anyone's career over a misunderstanding." "But I handcuffed a federal agent," Rodriguez said, his voice cracking slightly. "I arrested someone with your level of clearance. They're going to crucify me." "That depends entirely on how we handle the next few minutes," Sarah replied. "Officer Santos, I need you to call for your watch commander, but when you do, tell him we have a situation that requires immediate supervisory attention and discretion. Don't go into details over the radio." Santos nodded and keyed her radio, requesting the watch commander's immediate presence at their location. She had enough experience to know that some situations required careful handling, and this was clearly one of them. While Santos made the radio call, Sarah turned her attention back to Rodriguez. "Officer, I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer honestly. First, what exactly prompted you to detain me?" Rodriguez took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. "We had a briefing this morning about potential surveillance of federal buildings. The description was vague, but when I saw you observing our security setup and then being evasive about your work, I thought you might be conducting reconnaissance." Sarah nodded, understanding the logic even if she disagreed with the execution. "I see. And who gave this briefing?" "Sergeant Morrison. He said it came down from the district commander based on some federal intelligence report." This information caught Sarah's attention. She hadn't been briefed on any intelligence reports about potential surveillance of the Chicago Federal Building, which was unusual given her position and security clearance. It was possible that the threat was related to Operation Nightfall, or it could be an entirely separate issue that she wasn't aware of. "Officer Rodriguez, I need you to understand something," Sarah said, stepping closer to ensure privacy. "I wasn't conducting surveillance on this building. I work in this building. I was coming to work, just like I do every day. The reason I was observing your security setup is because it's my job to notice these things." "Your job?" Rodriguez asked, confusion evident in his voice. Sarah glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard, then continued. "Without going into classified details, I can tell you that I'm currently leading an investigation that involves potential threats to national security. My work requires me to maintain a low profile, which is why I couldn't immediately identify myself when you first approached me." Rodriguez felt a new wave of panic wash over him. Not only had he arrested a federal agent, but he had potentially interfered with a national security investigation. The implications were staggering. "What do I do?" Rodriguez asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do I fix this?" Before Sarah could answer, a black sedan pulled up to the curb nearby. Sarah recognized the vehicle immediately. It was one of the unmarked cars used by the federal building's security detail. This meant that word of the incident was already spreading through official channels, which could complicate her efforts to contain the situation. Two men in dark suits emerged from the sedan and began walking toward them. Sarah recognized one of them as Agent David Chun from the FBI's Chicago field office. Chen was someone she had worked with on previous joint operations, and his presence here meant that the incident had already been reported up the federal chain of command. "Agent Martinez," Chen called out as he approached, his voice carrying a mixture of concern and barely contained irritation. "We received reports of a situation involving one of our people.
Sarah walked toward Chen, intercepting him before he could reach Rodriguez and Santos. "Agent Chen, glad you're here.
We have a situation that requires careful handling." Chen looked past Sarah to where Rodriguez and Santos were standing, both officers clearly distressed by the rapidly evolving situation.
"I can see that. Care to explain how one of our senior investigators ended up in handcuffs on a public street?"
"Mistaken identity and overzealous security procedures," Sarah replied diplomatically. Officer Rodriguez was responding to a general alert about potential surveillance activities. When he saw me observing the security setup here, he made the reasonable assumption that I might be conducting reconnaissance.
Chen's expression softened slightly.
He had enough experience to understand how these kinds of misunderstandings could occur, especially in the current security environment where everyone was on high alert for potential threats.
"Are you compromised?"
Chen asked, using the code phrase that inquired whether Sarah's cover for Operation Nightfall had been blown.
"Potentially," Sarah replied. "Depends on how we handle this and what kind of exposure we've already had." Chen nodded, understanding the implications immediately.
If Sarah's cover was blown, it would mean months of investigative work down the drain and potentially dangerous exposure for other agents working the case. The second federal agent, whom Sarah didn't recognize, had been surveying the scene and taking notes. He approached Chen and whispered something in his ear that made Chen's expression grow more serious.
"Agent Martinez," Chen said, "we may have a bigger problem than just your cover. There's been some social media activity related to this incident.
Videos and photos are already starting to circulate online." Sarah felt her heart sink. Social media exposure was one of the worst possible outcomes for an undercover federal agent. Once images and videos started spreading online, it became nearly impossible to maintain any kind of covert identity.
"How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough," Chen replied.
"We're working on damage control, but you know how these things go.
Once something hits the internet, it's very difficult to completely contain."
At that moment, Watch Commander Lieutenant Patricia Williams arrived at the scene. Williams was a 20-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department with extensive experience in managing complex situations involving multiple agencies. She took one look at the assembled group, two clearly distressed patrol officers, three federal agents in serious conversation, and immediately understood that this was a significant incident requiring delicate handling.
"Somebody want to explain to me what's going on here?"
Williams asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to taking charge of chaotic situations.
Sarah made a quick decision.
"Lieutenant Williams, I'm Special Investigator Sarah Martinez with the DEA. There's been a misunderstanding involving your officers that we need to resolve quickly and quietly." Williams looked at Sarah's credentials, noting the high-level security clearances and classifications.
She had seen enough federal identification over the years to recognize when she was dealing with someone significant in the law enforcement hierarchy. "What kind of misunderstanding?" Williams asked.
"Your officers detained me based on a mistaken belief that I was conducting surveillance on the federal building," Sarah explained. "In reality, I'm a federal agent assigned to this facility, and I was simply coming to work. The situation has been resolved between us, but there are some complications we need to address." Williams looked over at Rodriguez and Santos, both of whom appeared to be in various stages of professional distress. She had seen this look before, officers who had made significant mistakes and were now facing potential career consequences. "Officers Rodriguez and Santos," Williams called out, "join us please." As the two officers approached, Sarah could see Rodriguez struggling to maintain his composure. The weight of what had happened was clearly crushing him, and she realized she needed to take action to prevent him from making the situation worse through panic or overreaction. "Lieutenant," Sarah said before Rodriguez could speak, "I want to make it clear that your officers were responding appropriately to a legitimate security concern." Officer Rodriguez followed proper procedure in questioning a suspicious individual near a federal facility. The mistake was understandable given the circumstances and the information he was working with. Williams looked surprised by Sarah's defense of the officers, but Chen nodded approvingly. Experienced federal agents understood the value of maintaining good relationships with local law enforcement, even when mistakes were made.
That's very generous of you, Agent Martinez, Williams said.
But I still need to understand exactly what happened and what the implications are for my department. Sarah was about to respond when her secure phone buzzed with an incoming encrypted message. She glanced at the screen and saw that it was from her team leader on Operation Nightfall. The message was brief but alarming: abort current location.
Possible compromise. RTB immediately.
The message confirmed her worst fears. The incident had already compromised her position, and the investigation that she had spent 8 months building was now at risk. Sarah's face went pale as she read the encrypted message. The abbreviation RTB, return to base, was used only when an operation was in immediate jeopardy. Her team leader wouldn't have sent this message unless the compromise was already confirmed and spreading through intelligence networks. Agent Chen noticed her expression change and stepped closer.
What is it?
We need to move this conversation somewhere more secure, Sarah said quietly.
And we need to do it now.
Lieutenant Williams looked around at the scene, federal agents checking phones, officers looking increasingly nervous, and a few remaining onlookers still trying to figure out what was happening. Her 20 years of experience told her that whatever was unfolding here was much bigger than a simple case of mistaken identity. There's a conference room on the district station 3 blocks away, Williams offered.
Completely secure, no windows, soundproofed.
That'll work, Chen said.
Agent Martinez, you ride with us. Lieutenant, can your officers meet us there?
Williams nodded and turned to Rodriguez and Santos.
You two, follow us to the station. Don't talk to anyone about this until we get this sorted out.
That includes other officers, your families, anyone.
Are we clear? Both officers nodded, though Rodriguez still looked like he might be sick.
Santos placed a reassuring hand on her partner's shoulder, understanding that his career anxiety was about to become their shared problem. As they prepared to leave, Sarah noticed a familiar figure approaching from across the street. Her heart sank even further as she recognized Marcus Webb, an investigative journalist from the Chicago Tribune who specialized in federal law enforcement stories. Webb had been trying to get information about federal operations in Chicago for months, and his presence here was the worst possible development.
Agent Chen, Sarah said quietly, nodding toward Webb. We have press incoming.
Chen looked in the direction Sarah indicated and immediately recognized Webb.
Damn.
Lieutenant, we need to move now, before he gets close enough to ask questions. Williams quickly organized the exodus, directing her officers to their patrol car while the federal agents moved toward their sedan. They managed to leave the scene just as Webb arrived at the location where the incident had occurred. Sarah watched through the rear window as Webb began questioning the few remaining bystanders, taking notes and photos of the area.
The drive to the police station was tense.
Sarah used her secure phone to send a coded message to her team leader, confirming that she was safe but that the operation was likely compromised.
The response came back quickly: full debrief required. Damage assessment in progress. Stand by for extraction protocols.
When they arrived at the district station, Lieutenant Williams led them to the promised conference room. It was a windowless space typically used for interrogations and sensitive briefings, with acoustic dampening that would prevent any conversations from being overheard. Once everyone was seated around the conference table, Sarah took a deep breath and made a decision that would change the trajectory of her career. Before we go any further, I need everyone in this room to understand the gravity of the situation we're dealing with. She pulled out her phone and showed them the message from her team leader.
This incident has compromised an ongoing federal investigation called Operation Nightfall.
We've been tracking an international arms trafficking network for 8 months, and we were less than 2 weeks away from making arrests that would have dismantled a major threat to national security.
Rodriguez went even paler than before. You mean because I arrested you, we let terrorists go free?
Not terrorists, but close enough, Sarah replied. The network we've been tracking has been supplying weapons to various criminal organizations and potentially hostile foreign actors. The intelligence we've gathered indicates they were planning to facilitate a significant arms transfer within the next 10 days.
Agent Chan leaned forward. How compromised are we talking about? Sarah checked her phone again. A new message had arrived with preliminary damage assessment information.
According to my team leader, social media posts from this incident have already been flagged by our monitoring systems. The good news is that most people assumed it was just a routine arrest. The bad news is that certain individuals have been specifically watching for any unusual federal law enforcement activity in this area.
Lieutenant Williams frowned. What kind of individuals?
The kind who work for the arms trafficking network we've been investigating, Sarah replied. They have people monitoring law enforcement activities around all major federal facilities. When videos of a young woman being arrested near the federal building started appearing online, it triggered their surveillance protocols.
The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications.
A routine police action based on a misunderstanding had potentially derailed months of federal investigative work and allowed dangerous criminals to escape justice. Rodriguez finally spoke up, his voice barely audible.
What can I do to fix this? There has to be something. Sarah looked at the young officer with a mixture of sympathy and professional assessment.
Officer Rodriguez, what happened here today was a perfect storm of miscommunication, overzealous security procedures, and bad timing. While your actions initiated the chain of events, the ultimate responsibility lies with the system that put us all in this position. That's generous, Chen said, but it doesn't solve our current problem.
Agent Martinez, what's your assessment of our options? Sarah had been thinking about exactly that question during the drive to the station. We have 3 potential courses of action.
First, we can try to salvage Operation Nightfall by implementing emergency protocols to protect our remaining assets and intelligence. Second, we can accelerate our timeline and attempt to make arrests before the targets can fully react to the compromise.
Third, we can abort the operation entirely and focus on damage control. What's your recommendation? Lieutenant Williams asked. Honestly? The operation is probably unsalvageable in its current form.
The moment my face appeared in those social media posts, anyone with half a brain in the trafficking network would have started implementing their security protocols.
They're probably already moving assets and changing locations.
Officer Santos, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, suddenly spoke up.
Wait a minute.
You said they have people monitoring federal law enforcement activities.
Are we talking about people who are already known to law enforcement?
Sarah looked at Santos with new interest.
That's a very good question. And, yes, some of them are known to us. Why do you ask?
Santos pulled out her own phone and started scrolling through recent arrest reports and intelligence bulletins. Because if they're known individuals who are actively monitoring federal activities, then they might also be monitoring local police activities.
And if that's the case, then this incident might not have been as random as we think.
The room went quiet again as everyone considered the implications of Santos's observation. Agent Chen was the first to speak.
Are you suggesting that someone might have deliberately triggered this situation?
I'm saying it's worth investigating, Santos replied. The briefing that Officer Rodriguez received this morning was supposedly based on federal intelligence about potential surveillance activities. But Agent Martinez wasn't aware of any such intelligence.
That seems like a significant disconnect.
Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Santos was right, the lack of communication about the supposed surveillance threat was unusual. In her position, she should have been briefed on any intelligence that could affect federal facilities where she was operating.
Lieutenant Williams, Sarah said, I need you to get me the exact details of this morning's briefing.
Who provided the intelligence, when it was received, and what specific threat information was included? Williams nodded and picked up the conference room phone to call back to the patrol division. While she was making the call, Agent Chen turned to Sarah with a grim expression. If Officer Santos is right, and this was a deliberate setup, then we're dealing with a much more sophisticated operation than we realized, Chen said.
The trafficking network would have had to have sources inside local law enforcement to pull something like this off.
Sarah was already running through the implications in her mind. It would explain how they knew to watch for federal activity in this specific area. And it would explain how they knew to trigger a police response that would force me to either compromise my cover or risk arrest.
Rodriguez looked confused.
But that would mean someone deliberately fed us false intelligence to make us arrest Agent Martinez.
Why would someone in law enforcement do that? Money, Santos said simply. Arms trafficking generates enormous profits. Enough to buy informants at multiple levels of law enforcement.
Lieutenant Williams finished her phone call and turned back to the group.
I have some preliminary information that you're not going to like.
The intelligence briefing this morning came through unofficial channels. Sergeant Morrison received a call from someone claiming to be with the FBI's Chicago field office, providing what was described as urgent threat information.
Agent Chen's expression darkened. I didn't authorize any such communication.
And our protocol would never involve calling local patrol supervisors directly with intelligence briefings.
Sarah felt the pieces clicking into place.
So someone, claiming to be federal law enforcement, called the Chicago Police Department with a false threat report specifically designed to trigger a police response when I showed up for work this morning.
That's what it looks like, Williams confirmed. Sergeant Morrison is pulling the phone records now to see if we can trace the call.
Rodriguez was beginning to understand the full scope of what had happened.
You mean I didn't just make a mistake? Someone set this whole thing up to make me arrest Agent Martinez?
It appears that way, Sarah said.
Which means this incident wasn't just a random misunderstanding.
It was a deliberate operation designed to compromise our investigation. The room buzzed with activity as everyone began to grasp the implications.
Agent Chen was already on his phone, calling the FBI's counterintelligence division to report the incident.
Lieutenant Williams was coordinating with her department to secure all records related to the morning's briefing. Santos was reviewing intelligence databases to cross-reference known trafficking associates with potential law enforcement connections. Sarah's secure phone buzzed again with another encrypted message. This one was longer and more detailed, providing updated intelligence about the trafficking network's response to the incident. What she read made her realize that the situation was even more complex than they had initially understood. Agent Chen, she said, interrupting his phone conversation.
We need to talk privately. Now.
Chen ended his call and followed Sarah to a corner of the conference room where they could speak quietly without being overheard by the local officers.
What is it? Chen asked. Sarah showed him the message on her phone.
Our intelligence analysts have been monitoring communications intercepts from the trafficking network. Based on the chatter they've picked up in the last hour, the network didn't just know about this incident, they were expecting it. Chen read the message, his expression growing increasingly grim.
They had advanced knowledge that you would be compromised today?
More than that, Sarah replied. According to this intercept analysis, they've been planning a specific response to my compromise for weeks.
This wasn't just an opportunistic reaction to a police incident. They've been preparing for this exact scenario. The implications were staggering.
Not only had the trafficking network infiltrated local law enforcement enough to trigger the morning's incident, but they had been planning for Sarah's eventual compromise as part of a larger strategy. This suggested a level of sophistication and intelligence capability that far exceeded what the federal task force had been expecting. Agent Martinez, Chen said quietly, if they were planning for your compromise, then they probably know more about Operation Nightfall than we realized.
How much of our investigation might be compromised? Sarah's phone buzzed again with another message.
This one contained information that would change everything they thought they knew about the case they had been building for the past 8 months. Agent Chen, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, I think we've been looking at this all wrong. The arms trafficking network we've been investigating, I don't think they're the real target.
I think we're the target.
The weight of Sarah's words hung heavy in the conference room as Agent Chen processed what she had just revealed. The idea that they had been the target all along fundamentally changed everything about Operation Nightfall and the events of the morning. Explain, Chen said, his voice tight with controlled tension.
Sarah pulled up the latest intelligence report on her secure phone. Our analysts have been cross-referencing the communications intercepts with historical data from similar operations.
What they've discovered is that every major decision we've made in Operation Nightfall has been anticipated by the trafficking network. Every surveillance location we've chosen, every witness we've approached, every tactical decision, they've been one step ahead of us the entire time.
Chen felt a chill run down his spine. You're talking about a mole.
I'm talking about something bigger than a mole, Sarah replied. I'm talking about an operation specifically designed to identify and compromise federal law enforcement capabilities. The arms trafficking was real, but it was also bait. They wanted us to investigate them so they could study our methods, identify our personnel, and map our intelligence capabilities.
The implications were staggering.
If Sarah was right, then Operation Nightfall hadn't been a federal investigation of criminal activity, it had been a criminal investigation of federal capabilities. 8 months of careful police work had actually been 8 months of inadvertently providing intelligence to hostile actors. Lieutenant Williams, who had been monitoring their quiet conversation from across the room, approached them.
Agents, I've received some additional information that I think you need to hear immediately.
Sarah and Chen turned their attention to Williams, who was holding a printout of phone records and communications logs. The call that triggered this morning's incident came from a phone number that's been flagged by federal intelligence agencies, Williams said. According to the FBI's database, the number is associated with a sophisticated intelligence operation that's been targeting law enforcement agencies across multiple jurisdictions. Chen took the printout and studied it carefully.
This is a known foreign intelligence number? Not foreign exactly, Williams corrected.
According to the database, it's associated with a private intelligence firm that's been contracting with various organizations to gather information about law enforcement capabilities. The firm operates legally, but their client list includes some questionable entities.
Sarah felt another piece of the puzzle fall into place. A private intelligence firm would have the resources and expertise to conduct the kind of sophisticated operation we're dealing with.
They would also have the legal cover to operate within the United States without triggering national security protocols. Officer Santos, who had been quietly working at her laptop throughout the conversation, suddenly looked up with an expression of alarm.
Agents, I think I've found something you need to see immediately.
Santos turned her laptop screen toward the group, showing a social media monitoring dashboard that was tracking posts related to the morning's incident. The videos and photos from this morning aren't just spreading randomly. They're being amplified by specific accounts that appear to be coordinated.
Sarah looked at the data Santos was showing them.
The pattern was unmistakable. Certain accounts were systematically sharing and resharing content from the incident, ensuring maximum visibility and reach. This wasn't organic social media activity, it was a deliberate information operation. Someone wanted these images to spread as widely as possible, Chen observed.
But why?
Rodriguez, who had been listening to the conversation with growing horror, suddenly spoke up.
Because they wanted to make sure everyone saw Agent Martinez's face. If she's undercover, then having her picture all over social media would completely destroy her ability to work covertly. Sarah nodded grimly. Rodriguez had grasped the essential point immediately. That's exactly right.
And if they can identify one undercover federal agent, they can potentially identify others using similar analysis techniques.
The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the full scope of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just about compromising Operation Nightfall or exposing Sarah's identity.
It was about developing techniques and capabilities that could be used to systematically identify and compromise federal law enforcement operations.
Agent Chen's phone rang with a call from the FBI's Chicago field office.
He answered it and spent several minutes in quiet conversation before hanging up and turning back to the group.
That was my supervisor, Chen said. The situation is bigger than we thought.
Similar incidents have been reported in 3 other major cities over the past month. Federal agents working undercover operations have been exposed through what appeared to be routine law enforcement interactions.
Sarah felt a sense of dread settling in. How many agents have been compromised?
At least 6 that we know of, possibly more, Chen replied. And, in each case, the exposure led to the collapse of major federal investigations. Lieutenant Williams was beginning to understand the national security implications of what had happened in her jurisdiction.
Are you saying that someone has been systematically targeting federal law enforcement operations across the country? That's exactly what we're saying, Sarah confirmed. And Chicago was apparently the next target on their list. Officer Santos was still monitoring the social media amplification when she noticed something new.
Agents, we have another problem.
The accounts that have been amplifying the incident videos are now starting to post additional content. They're sharing information about federal law enforcement techniques, operational security procedures, and agent identification methods.
Sarah looked at the new posts Santos was showing them and felt her blood run cold. The information being shared was highly classified, the kind of operational details that could only have come from someone with inside access to federal law enforcement training and procedures.
This confirms it, Sarah said. We're dealing with an intelligence operation that has penetrated federal law enforcement at a very high level. They're not just compromising individual agents, they're compromising the entire system.
Agent Chen was already dialing his supervisor again when Lieutenant Williams received a call on the conference room phone. She answered it and had a brief conversation before hanging up with a grim expression.
That was our intelligence liaison, Williams said.
Similar social media campaigns are now active in 17 cities across the country. Someone just launched a coordinated operation to expose federal law enforcement capabilities on a national scale. The room erupted in activity as everyone began making phone calls and coordinating responses. Sarah used her secure phone to contact her team leader and request immediate implementation of emergency security protocols.
Chen called the FBI's counterintelligence division to report a potential national security breach. Williams contacted the Chicago Police Department's intelligence unit to begin coordinating with federal agencies.
In the midst of all this activity, Rodriguez sat quietly in his chair, overwhelmed by the realization that his simple mistake had somehow triggered a national security crisis. Officer Santos noticed his distress and moved to sit beside him.
"Jake, this isn't your fault," Santos said quietly.
"You were manipulated by people who are very good at what they do.
If it hadn't been you, it would have been someone else."
Rodriguez looked up at her with haunted eyes.
"But I still did it.
I still arrested a federal agent and helped compromise a major investigation." Sarah overheard the conversation and ended her phone call to address Rodriguez directly. "Officer Rodriguez, I want you to listen to me very carefully. What happened this morning was not a failure on your part. It was a sophisticated intelligence operation designed to exploit normal law enforcement protocols. You responded exactly as you were trained to do."
"But the results," Rodriguez started to say. "The results are what they are because of criminal activity, not because of police work," Sarah interrupted.
"And, actually, your actions this morning may have inadvertently exposed something much bigger and more dangerous than the arms trafficking case we were originally investigating." Agent Chen finished his call and turned back to the group.
"Agent Martinez is right.
The FBI's analysis suggests that this intelligence operation has been gathering information about federal capabilities for at least 6 months. If we hadn't stumbled onto it today, they might have continued undetected for much longer." Sarah's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from her team leader. She read it quickly and, then, looked up at the assembled group.
"I just received word that federal agencies are implementing emergency security protocols nationwide. All undercover operations are being suspended pending a full security review. What does that mean for the arms trafficking network?" Lieutenant Williams asked.
"It means they won, at least in the short term," Sarah replied honestly. "By forcing us to implement emergency protocols, they've effectively shut down dozens of ongoing investigations across the country.
It will take months to assess the damage and rebuild our capabilities."
The room fell quiet again as everyone contemplated the scope of the victory that the intelligence operation had achieved. A single phone call to a Chicago police sergeant had triggered a chain of events that compromised federal law enforcement operations nationwide. Officer Santos, who had been continuing to monitor social media activity, suddenly looked up with a surprised expression.
"Wait a minute. I think we might have caught a break."
Everyone turned their attention to Santos, who was pointing at her laptop screen.
"The accounts that have been amplifying the incident videos just made a mistake. They posted some content that includes metadata showing their actual locations and IP addresses. Agent Chen immediately moved to look at Santos's screen. "Are you sure about this?" "Absolutely," Santos replied. They got overconfident and started posting in real time without properly scrubbing their digital footprints. "We now have physical locations for at least 3 of the operations centers they're using." Sarah felt a surge of hope for the first time since the morning's incident began. "Agent Chen, can the FBI coordinate simultaneous raids on those locations?" "Already on it," Chen said, dialing his phone again. "But we need to move fast. Once they realize their mistake, they'll shut down and relocate." As Chen coordinated with federal agencies to organize the raids, Sarah turned to address officers Rodriguez and Santos. "I want both of you to know that your work today, especially Officer Santos's technical analysis, has potentially turned a major defeat into a significant victory." Rodriguez still looked uncertain. "How do you figure?" Sarah smiled for the first time that day. "Because sometimes the best way to catch a sophisticated criminal operation is to let them think they've outsmarted you. They revealed their capabilities and their locations because they thought they had one. Now we're going to show them how wrong they were." Lieutenant Williams nodded approvingly. "And this all started because one of my officers did his job exactly as he was trained to do, even when the situation got complicated." Agent Chen finished organizing the federal response and turned back to the group. "Raids are being coordinated for simultaneous execution in 1 hour. We'll have teams hitting locations in Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, and Miami. If Officer Santos's analysis is correct, we're about to take down a major intelligence operation that's been targeting law enforcement agencies across the country." Sarah checked the time and realized that less than 4 hours had passed since Officer Rodriguez had first approached her on the street. In that time, they had uncovered and were now about to dismantle a sophisticated intelligence operation that had been operating undetected for months. "Officer Rodriguez," Sarah said, "when this is all over and the reports are written, the record is going to show that your actions this morning led to the exposure and destruction of a major threat to national security. That's not a bad day's work for a patrol officer." Rodriguez managed a small smile for the first time since the incident began. "Does this mean I'm not going to lose my job?" Lieutenant Williams laughed. "Officer Rodriguez, after today you're probably going to get a commendation. And, Officer Santos, your technical skills just help save federal law enforcement operations nationwide. I think both of your careers are going to be just fine." As they prepared to leave the conference room and coordinate the final phases of the operation, Sarah reflected on how quickly things could change in law enforcement. This morning she had been leading a routine investigation into arms trafficking. This afternoon she was part of a federal task force dismantling an intelligence operation that threatened national security. The incident that had started with a simple case of mistaken identity had revealed layers of deception and manipulation that none of them could have anticipated. But it had also demonstrated the importance of good police work, careful analysis, and the willingness to question assumptions even when everything seemed straightforward. As Agent Chen coordinated the final details of the raids, Sarah's secure phone buzzed one more time with a message from her team leader: "Operation Nightfall officially closed. Operation Daybreak officially opened. Good work, Agent Martinez. See you at the debrief." Sarah smiled as she read the message. Operation Nightfall was over, but Operation Daybreak, the takedown of the intelligence operation that had been targeting federal law enforcement, was just beginning. And it all started because Officer Jake Rodriguez had yanked her by the collar until Chief Chen noticed the classified badge beneath her jacket.